First of all, it's always important, certainly, especially important today, I think, in the topic, to acknowledge that we're on the land of the First Nations people of this country, the Wurundjeri people, the Kulin Nation, and this is land that was never ceded. And so we acknowledge that and give our respects to elders past, present, and emerging. And I think that'll come up in our conversation as well, but that's an important thing to remind us of as we're looking at racism. You would think by now that we were experts in understanding racism, having good data sets and knowing what it means. Jonathan's going to tell us that no, actually we're pretty rubbish at it, but we could do better and we should do better, and there are ways of doing it. So to a large extent, that's been the work that Jonathan's been doing in his CRIS postdoctoral project, trying to understand what we know about racism and how we document it and how we should be doing it and what it means. So if I say anything more, I'll be taking away from Jonathan's presentation. So he'll unpack these issues.
Thank you very much.
So thank you very much.
Yeah, appreciate it. And thanks for having me, everyone. Kira for organizing. Thanks, Greg. I hope also that everyone's doing well here and also online. And I also wanted to wish Ramadan Mubarak to our Muslim colleagues and friends before I start. And before I start, I would like, of course, to acknowledge that we are here on the unceded land of the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation, and to pay my respects to the elders, past, present, and emerging. And today, a bit like Greg just said, I thought I'd introduce you to our CRIS project on racism data in Australia. This project is the first comprehensive stocktake review of our knowledge of racism based on quantitative data and research to date. And we can start from a quick snapshot, I thought it'd be a good place, of racism in Australia. So let us begin. And another click here. Some images just for our background. And these images illustrate some of the forms that racism has taken in recent times and years. So we've seen, for example, Islamophobia and targeting of Muslim Australians. Then there's a reported rise in anti-Semitism towards Jewish Australians, criminalization of African Australians, and discrimination against Asian Australians and temporary migrants in the context of COVID-19. Also racial hatred online and in the media. There's quite a lot for us to be documenting and researching. Meanwhile, of course, colonization and oppression of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Island peoples continues to unfold and bear devastating consequences. We know that racism in Australia is prevalent. The Mapping Social Cohesion report consistently shows that between 13 and 20% of the adult population reports it. And of course, there are much higher rates among certain migrant and minority groups. It is also institutionally entrenched, and we've seen examples of this in government, media discourses, and in sports clubs and schools in Victoria in the last couple of years. And racism is impactful. It's affecting various areas of life, from health and well-being to employment and housing prospects. At the same time, in the last few years, there seems to be more discussion of racism as a problem. So that's in the media, and also we see a momentum for anti-racism initiatives by policymakers and other stakeholders and groups. So of course, we have The Voice that is being discussed at the moment. And for example, we have a few organizations here that have been doing anti-racism work. We have the AHRC, Australian Human Rights Commission, that's developing Australia's next national anti-racism framework with $7.5 million that have been committed by the federal government. In Victoria, we have Victorian VicGov that has been developing its own action plan and set up an anti-racism task force and providing pretty generous funding for local anti-racism programs. That's also from a couple of years ago, that recent funding round. The Uruk Justice Commission runs an inquiry into injustices experienced by Indigenous people in Victoria. And then there are initiatives at municipal levels, for example, cities of Whittlesea, Wyndham, and others are doing some great work with our colleagues from CRIS as well, I should mention. On top of that, there's smaller community and local initiatives and projects that are going on, and that could be through protests, art projects, online, and various other forms. An important means to support any form of anti-racism is quality research and data, as these stakeholders recognize. And there are several ways that research and data can contribute to anti-racism. So first of all, data can raise awareness about racism and push for advocacy and funding. This is something that a lot of our community organizations partners have been seeking to do. Data can inform policy and action and show that anti-racism actions are more effective, which ones of them are more effective through evaluation. Data can also help articulate experiences with racism for people who are affected. And we have seen generally that there's more data on racism that is being collected. But at the same time, the data that we have seems to be limited in important ways, as this quote from the HRC shows us. So robust, nationally consistent data about racism and racial inequality is not available in Australia. That's their take on that. Our own understanding of the forms, nature, and impact of racism, and that's according to our reviews, isn't as well developed as it should be. Beyond that, the collection and analysis of racism data are usually scattered. They have considerable gaps and overlaps, and they tend to be poorly linked and underutilized. So that's data and data sets. Still, no one, as far as we know, well, we have a pretty good grasp of that. So no one to date has reviewed this evidence-based and our knowledge of racism in Australia. So it pretty much remains unclear what data we actually have at the moment, what is missing, and what data is needed, and what existing data actually says. And with this, we'll segue into our project. We'll be responding to these gaps and have been conducting what is the first comprehensive review of racism data in Australia. And we focus on quantitative data and research, which is a limitation to our scope that we acknowledge. I'm happy to chat about this a bit more later. And yeah, there's very much a need also for a review of what qualitative data has been collected to date, and that will be quite extensive. This is a CRIS project, and it's nested within a stream that's working on challenging racism and enhancing social belonging. I'm a coordinator of that stream, and I'm working with Professor Kevin Dunn from Western Sydney University and Ian Paradis, Professor Ian Paradis from Deakin, who are co-leading our work. On this particular project, we have a fairly large team of anti-racism researchers. And I just want to mention this team because the project obviously wouldn't be possible without a consistent engagement over these last few years. It's been some very difficult times for all of us. So from Deakin, we have Emmanuel Elias, we have Ian Paradis, we have Fethi, we have Jess Walton, who recently moved to government, and we have Ayuba Isaka. From Western Sydney, we have Kevin Dunn, Craig McGarty, Nida Denson, and Rachel Sharpless. And we also have Mandy Truong from Monash University and the Australian Institute of Family Studies. Originally, the project was framed around data gaps in Victoria, but we have since expanded our scope, mostly geographically to the national level. And then there's also some tangents and orientations that are more global that I'll discuss in a little bit. The project has two parts that complement each other. The first part is a review of existing racism data and an attempt at bridging those data gaps that we've identified. What data do we actually have? What's missing? These are some of the core questions that are leading us. And we've set out to do three main things. First of all, organize existing racism data, then identify gaps to data and to our knowledge, again, based on quantitative research that's been done to date. And thirdly, to recommend how these data gaps can be bridged. And this part of our work is nearing its completion. We have recently submitted a final paper, and it's right now under review. Then there's the second part of all of this. That's a meta-analysis of the prevalence and effects of racism in Australia. So this one is more focused on findings. What does the data actually say? and this work is very much ongoing. We're hoping to finish it this year. Both parts have some strong links to policy. We discussed them in a couple of policy papers that we published last year, and actually also in 2021. The project has also been used in informing the upcoming National Anti-Racism Framework by the Australian Human Rights Commission. We also call in this recent publication, or the one we've just have under review at the moment. So we call in this project to approach racism data as data for anti-racism. So this is an active reorientation to racism data that's seeking to make it more useful and accessible beyond academia. As part of that approach, we argue that researchers should make anti-racism the end goal of racism data collection. The data should address real needs and have tangible effects, that Indigenous governance, sovereignty, and autonomy over data relating to First Nations people should be integral to any effort to challenge racism nationally, and that data should originate collaboratively with groups who are affected and be made more accessible and usable, possibly also as a vehicle for self-expression and self-determination. This is very quickly a scheme of how we've done the review part of the racism data gaps portion of the study. So this is part one. And here we have 4 key stages. I'll go over this really quickly, also because it's quite boring and fairly technical. And it could go a very long while for me to actually cover this in depth. So very quickly, what we first do and did in this case was searching databases like Scopus. Here you have, I think, just racism as a keyword, but there were many more. We ran various keywords through them and actually had a couple of searches because we need to extend those searches. Anyway, at the end of all of this, we got over 6,000 references, which we then imported into EndNote, and we started some screening. That's number 2 down there on the left. We've been screening references, titles, and abstracts using clear inclusion and exclusion criteria. And after that process, we kept several hundreds of papers, and that moves us to number 3, where we've screened them once more, this time looking at the PDFs and the full texts, and using an Excel spreadsheet at the same time, trying to assess which of these papers actually have been conducted in Australia, use empirical research, and report quantitative data on measures of racism. Altogether, after this phase, we had 48 studies. 32 of them are national studies, and another 16 are focused on Victoria. And then the sort of final stage in this slide is the actual data extraction from these 48 studies, and there's some coding that's involved. And we've extracted and coded the study and participant characteristics, then any measures of racism, either as experienced or expressed by study participants, then there's some association data on racism in health and socioeconomic outcomes. And after these 4 stages, and people who have been doing review work will be very familiar with this, it's quite a lot of work. After these 4 stages come the synthesis, or 5 stages, come the synthesis or analysis. And in the case of our second part of the same project, that is the meta-analysis, that's actually a meta-analytic software that we'll be using. And yeah, there's also other ways of doing that. For the meta-analysis, we are actually moving some of that process to a software called Covidence. I won't bore you with that. But yeah, just in a nutshell, what we've been up to. And so far, as I mentioned, we found 32 national studies and 16 that are non-national and focused on Victoria, sometimes also focused on other states. There are also 10 organizations that we've identified who are routinely collecting data on racism at the moment. 6 of them are at the national level and 4 of them are based in Victoria. We found that data collection has been increasing over time. Only 5 of these studies, and of course, some studies have more than 1 paper that's reporting them. Some of them have quite a lot of documents that are related to the same study. For example, LSIC, LSAC, HILDA, they've all been reported across across different publications. So in terms of the collection of racism data over time, only 5 studies actually started collecting data before 2000, and we had 9 in the 2000s and another 18 that have started collecting racism data since 2010. Altogether, these studies have collected data from over 300,000 participants. That's quite a lot of data. We found that existing data often focuses on cross-sectional studies, so cross-sectional data often in a single time point. About 18 of the 32 national studies do that, and they often focus on adult populations. It's half of the studies that we found. We also classified and organized data based on forms and settings of racism as experienced, forms of racism as expressed, targets, ethnic, racial, religious backgrounds, and association with health and socioeconomic outcomes, like I mentioned before. And the existing data we found focuses often on the following forms of racism, mostly interpersonal. Racism is interpersonally experienced. Forms of racism that are left unspecified. So a question, for example, like, have you experienced discrimination based on da, 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 da? And that's something we can find in the mapping Scanlon, in the mapping social cohesion report by the Scanlon Foundation. Insults are studied quite often. Physical forms of racism are also studied quite widely in this literature, and forms of exclusion. In terms of the settings that are most widely studied, these studies tend to focus on work, education, contact with the legal system, and public places. The groups that have been most widely studied to date are Indigenous people, Muslim Australians, and Asian Australians. And some of the studies also report on effects. 7 of them reported on mental health effects, and 6 of them on physical health effects. So I just wanted to show you a quick snapshot of examples of what this actually looks like when reported. Yes. And yeah, maybe take a couple of seconds to take this in. This is from our report from last year. And the table, this particular table, there are 8 tables altogether. This table looks at study characteristics. In each row, we have a study. And so, for example, the one that is marked is the Australian Values Study. And we can see here that it was reported in racism data from this study was reported, for example, in that paper by Shin and Dovidio. There are 5 points of data collection that we detailed the years for, starting in 1981. That data is presently being collected and is also accessible. So that could be quite useful for people who are seeking to know what is happening with people who are reporting for this study. It is, the design is repeated cross-sectional. So it's collected, data that's collected from different participants over different time points. It is conducted at the national level and is nationally representative. And here we have also some details about the demographics of study participants. And so, yes. We can also go, of course, by each of these columns and see, for example, what study designs have been reported across, have been used across this literature. So we can see, for example, these studies here that have all been longitudinal. So if we want to get a sense about racism in Australia based on longitudinal studies, we could start from this literature, for example. So some of the ways we could actually use this inventory. Okay. Another thing we are reporting is participant ages, and in this very same way, we can also see which studies focused on, for example, young people and children. These will be the 4 in highlights, and we can go back to them if we're interested in doing a study of that or literature review of that. Another example are different settings where racism is experienced. So here there are 15 settings that we've coded and an inventory that's showing which were included actually in each of these studies. For example, these are all settings that were captured by the longitudinal study of Indigenous children. And we can also focus on all the national studies looking at racism in work settings, or those that are looking at racism in sport. We can see there are not too many, and that's actually one of the gaps that we've identified. We have done the same for forms of racism that's experienced. Here you can see all the studies that examined experiences with racist insults and other forms of verbal abuse and jokes. Again, mind you, some of these tables are actually cut at the end, so it actually keeps on going on and on. And the last, hopefully the right one. Yeah, we can also get to this last quick example of the groups that who have been studied as targeted by racism. And for example, if we are focusing on racism towards Asian Australians, these studies would be a fairly good point to start from. So yeah, again, just some examples to get our head around what data exists out there. So based on the review, we then identified areas where our knowledge of racism is more limited, and we've been looking at bridging those data gaps. So first of all, there seems to be heaps of data that does exist, but have been under-analyzed. And this data should be a priority for us instead of reinventing the wheel, obviously. There's a lot of also research fatigue and other phenomena that are related to data collection that we should be trying to reduce and just do differently or do better on. We can use these data to improve our understanding of, and I outline here 3 different areas. First of all, perpetrator demographics, where we often collect this data, but we leave it under-analyzed, although it could be useful in targeting interventions. So we would have data about perpetrators' backgrounds, and the same perpetrator groups are also studied in terms of their perpetrations of racism, but we're not really piecing this information together. So things like perpetrators' ages, their ethnic background, perpetrators' income, education, and so on. These could be things that we actually know because we have the data, but we haven't really analyzed it just yet. Another thing is localities. Something quite similar is happening here, where we have been collecting postcode data and other geographic data, but we rarely use them. And this could help directing locally specific and targeted anti-racism initiatives. Then there are also studies that collect data from the same participants on experiences of racism in health and economic outcomes. But again, this data is not very widely used for these analyses. So our understanding, for example, of the connections between racism and physical health are quite limited, more limited than the data could actually show us. Then the second part of this slide is about racism data collection, where we also identify areas where existing data seems still insufficient to answer important questions. And there are 5 areas here. So first of all, settings that researchers have been fairly slow to look at, like online settings and the sharing economy, and digital technologies that perpetuate racial bias. Also, media and sports settings have been surprisingly understudied so far. Then there are forms that have been understudied, like structural and vicarious forms of racism, then racist harassment, unfair assumptions, hypervigilance, over-policing, and securitization. These are just some of the forms that have been less studied across this evidence base. There's also little research done with some important cohorts who experience racism, including young people and migrants. And there's little on what people actually do in responding to racism. This is something that I also have taken up in some of my other work following my PhD, working with migrants. What is actually being done when people experience it? It's really not the end of the story there. And then finally, we have a limited understanding and ability to respond to racism over time. This is something that's been highlighted by a few organizations. We found very few longitudinal studies, so these 6 studies that I mentioned before are really the core of that, and also routine initiatives for data collection that have fairly limited capacity. Then there's the policy side of all of this, and we've made a few arguments that are relevant to policymakers. I'll just very briefly run through them. First, we previously suggested coming up with a research agenda and data management plan for better coordination, long-term direction, and resourcing of the racism research effort. These would routinely identify gaps in research and priority areas in anti-racism policy and practice, and direct research accordingly. Secondly, we also called to mandate key agencies to routinely collect, monitor, and report, and also address data and the phenomena, of course, underlying it on racism and racial ethnic disparities in Australia. And thirdly, from a more global perspective, we've proposed the review as a template for other stocktakes that seek to inform anti-racism in other countries. It is an interesting moment also because there is recognition of how research and data can help orienting anti-racism efforts and of the need to coordinate anti-racism action more broadly. And we've seen this coming from places such as Canada, where there's an anti-racism program running until 2024 by the European Commission with an agenda, an action plan actually running until 2025, and the United Nations as well. So there might be some more work in the pipeline there and trying to make it more coordinated and better used. And as I mentioned, the second part of the study is underway at the moment, so I'll just take 1 minute to explain what we're doing there. Essentially, we're bringing together the stats from across all the quantitative studies of racism in Australia. And this will give us a clear idea of the prevalence and impact of racism. It could give us more conclusive answers to questions such as how has racism and its forms changed over time? How does it vary across settings and between different groups? And so far, it looks like we'll have over 100 studies for that part of the project. And again, fingers crossed we can finish this by the end of this year. So just a quick summary here, and this is the last slide, the one before last, and some key takeaways for us. So we're doing the first comprehensive review to take stock of racism data in Australia. It's a novel attempt to organize existing data, identify and fill data gaps, and enhance data use. We're also aiming to support anti-racism nationally as a foundation for a data management plan and research agenda. And it may be used as a template for other stocktakes in other locations, nationally and internationally. And then the last bit is that meta-analysis of the prevalence and impact of racism in Australia that is coming up next. And just a few of our publications from this project so far. So the top ones are project publications that have been completed. And then we have these two that are coming up, one of them under review and one in preparation, and then some related work by the team. And I think that's it. So thank you very much.
Thank you. Jehonathan, could you give us some quick takeaways on significant patterns you found in the data?
Yeah, so a bit like I was saying, we have that breakdown into study characteristics and participants, demographics, then the actual forms and settings and impacts of racism. And we have seen, unsurprisingly, that some of the ones that are most widely studied, that have been getting most attention from that literature, have been, adult populations. there have been the kind of studies you'd expect would be conducted, like cross-sectional studies that really look at only one point in time. The forms of racism that is being studied most often is interpersonal racism, rather than, I should have said that actually, rather than structurally and vicariously. So knowing about racism through other people's experiences or witnessing racism that happens to other people, that's being studied less often. Yeah, this is just the beginning of that. Another part is the studies that look at impact often look at health, racism and health, but we do see that there's not enough of that, and we definitely need more to come up with stronger conclusions, more analysis, not necessarily more data collection. Yeah, and really encouraging people not to collect data if that data already exists and has not been analyzed extensively.
Yes. So, Ulrike from Europe. No, very impressive, I think, and what you just said, that more people should use existing data for secondary analysis, so I think that's very important. I was wondering, because we take for granted the notion of racism, which in other places is very much contested, so I would like to know whether you had some kind of working definitions, or whether you, through the analysis of the different papers you analyze, you come to like a grounded theory thing almost, to a definition, and what that means, because I mean you mentioned different forms of racism.
Yes.
Very much
we actually have it on the slide right here. Is it possible to share? Share it again. So it's a fairly bulky definition. I think it really captures everything. It has been work in progress, absolutely. I think all of us also, having worked in that sphere for quite a while, we've all coming into this with different definitions, and we've been molding them and trying to improve them, and also making them in a way maybe a bit more comprehensive over time, because we realize that some forms used to be left outside, and actually they're really important and definitely qualify as racism according to the core of that definition. So hopefully we can still share that. Just in a nutshell, we look at racism as a system of oppression, and we look at hierarchies that it creates between people and groups that disadvantages some groups and advantages other groups, and how these hierarchies are used then to discriminate, allocate resources. Also privilege is obviously the other side of the same coin. We look at it across different levels. So here we go. Yeah, so we include different levels of racism, as you know, that second part that says about it being multifaceted. Yeah, it's also based on the different bases for racism. That's something that's been discussed now for a while. Religious bases would also, in our definition, count as racism. Anti-Semitism is racism. Islamophobia is racism. So we include all. Yes.
Thanks so much.
No worries.
So just a quick question. You've spoken about data collection in other countries such as Canada and so on. I was just interested to know examples of where the data collection has actually been translated to improved or better government policy or programs.
Yeah, we've been looking at that. That's a bit of an unfortunate point so far, because we feel like there is a lot that is being done, but how does it really trickle to that area effectively? I think Canada would be the first place I would go to, also because it's explicitly mentioned in policies also from different jurisdictions in Canada. So British Columbia, for example, some great examples coming from there in terms of really ingraining racism data collection and reporting in how I think the state deals with racism into the long term. So this will be one of the starting points. Also in Canada, sort of more nationally, there's a push for that. So I don't know if it's really using British Columbia as a model, but some of what I've read seems to be looking at the potential of data for anti-racism in similar way to how it's conceived in the British Columbian case. Yeah. Sure.
Hey, thanks for your presentation. I'm really interested in the idea of vicarious racism. It's a bit of an eye-opener because I feel like I haven't really heard that before. Do you want to talk a little bit more about it and how you studied it and how? Yeah.
Of course. So we're quite limited here because this is quantitative data. But we're looking at measures that have looked at either racism as being witnessed, so racism that is being expressed or experienced by someone else in your vicinity is being witnessed by you, for example, as a study participant in that case, if you'd like to report that, and also knowledge of racism. So knowledge of racism as occurring towards other people. It can be their personal stories and experiences that have come to your attention. And so there are studies of the effect of that also on health. So knowing about racism that has been experienced by people around in that case, people have been participants in these studies, has had an effect also on health outcomes, for example. It can be quite powerful. And I think also for many of us, when we think about racism, it's often it goes beyond the individual. And my own personal experiences, it's that knowledge of racism. It could be in Australia, where that kind of intersects also with the more structural, systemic forms of that. But in a way, that knowledge is vicarious as well. And it could be the experiences of my friends. I don't have family in Australia, but if I did, it could be family, it could be other people in my life or just around me. It could be someone out on the street, where I'll be exposed to that. Okay, this is happening and might trigger all sorts of responses.
Interesting. Thanks.
Sure.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, it's great to see so much being done with all that work.
Yeah, I need to say thank you also. So Alex was, it's reviewed our report from last year. So thanks for that.
Oh, my pleasure. Yeah, I was just curious because, you make a really good point about needing to get more information about perpetrators. But also keeping in mind that we need to shift away from just looking at interpersonal racism. Like when you're talking about that, have you thought about perpetrators in terms of not necessarily individuals? Could it be organizations or in?
To be honest, we haven't discussed it much beyond the interpersonal level, but it's absolutely yes, spot on. Racism as a systemic phenomenon is so much about how powerful organizations, especially, perpetrate it. And so it will be the individuals who are leading these organizations, but also different cultures within them and ways of doing things and particular assumptions and expectations that need to be contested. And you could also try and study where do these organizations sort of fall between, what kind of organizations maybe are more likely to perpetrate racism, but we haven't done it too much for this. So it's a great point.
Yeah, I guess it's hard because there may not be a distinct perpetrator if it's systemic.
But organizations, institutions, 100%. It's like it all kind of falls within that rubric and needs to get more attention to. And I think we actually do have the capacity to look at some of that. Not so much at racism, but there's recently more attention to demographics within workplaces, for example. Who is in management and who is not. So doing some similar or related work, I think, can be very useful. So it's a good point.
How would you draw the boundary, the conceptual boundary between discrimination then and racism? Because some of what you bring up or what you just said in other places would be rather captured through approaches to combat discrimination, which then has a different legal anchoring.
I'm happy to take it. So discrimination is more of the action or behavior side of racism. Racism is more of a high-level concept, and we have discrimination here as well as the more enacted side of that, obviously, when we look at that, we look at race-based, ethnicity-based, religion-based, nationality-based, and so on, basis for discrimination. But for us, mostly it will be included within our definition of racism as a broader, and then racism, of course, also including things like prejudice, like bias, microaggressions that will fall into discrimination more. But there's all these different attitudinal and then behavioral, and then also other concepts that all fall within our understanding of racism.
I was just going to say congratulations on what must have been incredibly laborious and important work.
You have no idea.
But I was just wondering how, I mean, you created an incredibly valuable resource, so I'm wondering how, or if that is going to be shared, because, you know, you were basically presenting a database that a lot of other people could use to do a lot more analysis. So I was just wondering about that. I mean, and the other thing that really leapt out to me in terms of the longitudinal stuff is that I was interested to what extent there's an appetite for longitudinal monitoring of racism, and the way you have like the Scandin Foundation, and whether the Human Rights Commission is thinking about that in terms of its framework for anti-racism.
Can you repeat that part? So an appetite for
a longitudinal tracking.
Yes, very much so.
As a national project.
No, thanks. Extremely laborious. Can't even find my words anymore. Has really been a lot of work of a few years, and we have a lot of people who are part of that. So, trying to piece all of that together. And I sometimes also realize this really doesn't convey much of that massive inventory we have and all the hours and years of working to that. But I suppose that's true for a lot of kinds of research. The point on sharing is something we're also really grappling with. Really open for suggestions. That's one thing. I'm thinking maybe to share the actual Excel spreadsheet with all the data, make that public as well. We are sharing these tables in reports, but it's very tricky to actually scroll down 50, 60 pages and get to that. And okay, how does that relate to what I need for my study? So I think maybe an Excel that's like easily sortable, as user-friendly as possible, because people don't like Excels. But if you have other suggestions, very open to that.
Well, on that, have you done much data visualization? Have you
not for this one, no.
Because that would certainly make it so much more accessible if you could graphically represent some of the patterns you're seeing.
Yeah, with like Power BI, where you can like filter it to
different
graphs and stuff.
Yeah, a good example is our World in Data. But also the International Institute for Economics and Peace does great data visualization. Just so that it's readily, and then you get media attention too, because the media can digest it. And they like those graphic images, so they can run with a story.
Yeah, no, that'd be great. We have converted some of that into charts. I think one of the issues is that, especially with the first part of the study, it's really about what kind of data has been collected and what kind of data is not, and it might not be very compelling as in a visual form. Like I tried it a couple of times, and I was like, not sure about it, but I'm sure there's better ways of doing that.
Yeah, even sort of basic stuff. I mean, even basic stuff like that, simple, bar graph at least gives you a rough sense. Okay, most of it's this stuff, some of it's this stuff, there's a little bit of this stuff.
What's the terrorism one that you can search by country and it comes up with all this?
So the International Institute of Economics and Peace does the Global Terrorism Index, does the Global Peace Index, and a bunch of others, mostly annual. And they always have data visualization in the form of maps, but also charts and graphs that are helpful. And our World in Data is a site online, of course, it does this very nicely.
Yeah, brilliant. Thanks. Another point there is that it might be, especially for the more international audiences of this that we're hoping to have a little bit down the track, it will be more about the template than the actual data, unfortunately. I mean, understandably also, but it will be really about these headers and trying to operationalize the inventory of, how do we even start collecting racism data, what kind of data be more commonly collected, what data and what ideas of, forms of racism are less known of, and working from there. And we are trying to, so this is one of the things going to be trying to convey to people overseas. Yeah.
Could you unpack for us your thinking about intent, sort of motivation, intent, and impact? Because classically, anecdotally, you hear incidents where somebody will say, "Well, I didn't mean that," but of course, the impact can be devastating.
Yeah.
And clearly, sometimes there are incidents of racism where, regardless of the perpetrator not being conscious of what they're doing, or maybe not being very intentional, it's still a devastating consequence.
Yeah, and it's constantly a discussion. Also in media and politics, someone will say something and they'll dismiss it, or I didn't mean it that way, and there's no intention. Yes, therefore it's not racist.
Well, there's some cynical, deliberate.
Yes, there's that too.
Liability going on there.
Yeah. So I think maybe first of all, from sort of studies perspective, we are interested in racism as intended and also as unintended. And obviously a lot of structural, broader picture stuff that is happening in Australia is a consequence of, it keeps on going, still racism unfolding and enacted in ways that not everyone would be intending for. And
so unconscious bias is a big part.
So unconscious bias is a part of that, but it's more the individual, that will be more the individual level. Definitely interested in that, and we would count that as an important part of the story. People are not aware that they are being racist, or that they hold to racist attitudes or values, but it's still very important in how it shapes not only the way that they act, but it shapes the experiences of other people. And I think the most important thing for us, and we focused on that also in some previous meta-analysis, is how racism is experienced. So people at the end of experiencing racism, and then the motivation of a potential perpetrator is less important. And we've seen that experiences of racism in themselves, they are very impactful. So for example, something like mental and physical health, there's some very strong correlations for some of these outcomes with just how you have experienced, the extent to which you've been experiencing racism. At the same time, of course, it's very important to also look at the more intentional forms of that. So, it's not really to do away with that.
Sorry.
I was just going to ask about the longitudinals. How far back? So how far back do these studies go? I mean, obviously there have been surveys done probably in some places in the world since the 50s, but in the Australian context, how far back can you go? And because there'll be some interesting trends.
Oh yeah. And we're really keen to look at that in the meta-analysis, like trying to really, this is one of the key tasks for that, trying to piece together this picture of racism over time, how it's been unfolding, because we do have, for example, the Scanlon Foundation Mapping Social Cohesion report only been running since 2007. There's like a bit of a gap there in 2008, I think, and 2009 till now is good. Obviously, they only measure certain forms, and it's limited, it hasn't really been published in peer-reviewed publications and so on. But how does that stack up with some of the other publications that have been done earlier on? How does that work with some of the work that's done even by Andrew Marcus that goes to the 1990s? Then there's a lot of work by colleagues, I think Kevin is still with us online, colleagues at the Challenging Racism Project at Western Sydney, that has been more recent to that. So I think actually some of that has preceded the Mapping Social Cohesion report since I think 2000 and 2006 and 2015-16 was another national survey. And then going back, so back to your question also, the first data that we have here is from 1981. And it's mainly because we're looking at empirical, quantitative, more like academic published studies. But there's also opinion polls, obviously. There's also other ways of collecting data that have happened before that. I think Emmanuel might have some kind of sense of what's happened before the 80s. I think some of that is also the quality of some of these opinion polls from the 70s is very limited. I think we talked about it in one of the earlier publications. Some of them excluded women, for example. Yeah, so
We can't be racist.
We
can't be racist.
Can be experienced. Yeah. So yeah, it's quite challenging actually to go back to that, and you do need to put some quality, I suppose, criteria for inclusion of some of these studies. But at the same time, very interesting, and obviously the forms that we're aware of, like the conversation, the awareness of systemic racism as a systemic phenomenon, things that are happening in institutions. A lot of that has surged more recently. You know, we're talking about vicarious racism before. How much of that would we have before 2000? Probably none.
Alex?
Yeah, I was just thinking, like, as you're saying, that database that you have would be really great for researchers to know what's been done and see, like, you know, perhaps what they shouldn't be researching or what they should, so that they can be more focused. I'm just thinking, like, there would potentially be capacity to connect that up to create like a resource for researchers working on racism to like understand like what's been done, but could that also be connected up with other resources, say like what Mario is doing around how to actually conduct anti-racist research and go more into the methodology and things to make sure that like, because a lot of times, you know, the way that research is done can perpetuate structures and systems of racism as well. So would there be potential to actually connect up with and make it into like a larger thing?
It would be brilliant. I'm all for it. I think one big question is about the efforts that are already happening right now on this exact same front. So the AHRC are thinking not exactly in the same terms as us on data management plan and the research agenda, but there's some movement there. We're kind of gauging that by the scoping review that they put out end of last year. And so my take on that is that if we have an inventory or we have a tool that is really as encompassing as that, it should probably start with them as one of these stakeholders, but not maybe not the leaders of that even, but they have to be in that conversation. There are also 4 or 5 other organizations. FECA will be definitely, and indigenous organizations and agencies as well. So that's a part of that. There's a question there about the levels in which racism is studied. So, you know, us focusing on the national level is also a limitation, obviously, because a lot of what is happening also in terms of data collection happens at this very grassroots level. And so for the meta-analysis, we'll be looking also beyond that national scope. This is a bit of a first, that other part of the study we're kind of starting from. Does it? Yeah, happy to chat about this more. Yeah, it would be great to make that better known and obviously more useful. I think that's the end of the day, that's the purpose of what we're doing. So yeah, visualization, Excel's collaboration, working with Mario and others who are working on anti-racism at the level of local councils, municipalities. Absolutely.
Are there studies around the world that you look at and say that's kind of a gold standard, we want to copy that? Is anyone doing it really well?
Again, probably Canadians would be the first ones to go to. What is happening over there? Every now and then there is, so within the area of effective anti-racism, which we've done a review of, there is a kind of thread that looks at anti-racism in organizations. And that's usually as a holistic sort of approach to, and Emmanuel and I wrote about this more recently. And so there's some organizations and also some city councils that have had these fairly extensive initiatives. I think one of them in a city, might be Vancouver, they had an anti-racism plan for the city. Then there's some hospitals that have been, but that's more like doing anti-racism. I don't know how much of that has been evaluated. But in terms of data collection, these, it's pretty patchy. And obviously a lot of that is being done sort of internally. So, government agencies collecting some data, but no one knows what's being done, and it's not shared, and it's like a whole sort of shrouded in mystery sort of layer to it. Yeah.
Maybe the diversity and inclusion training is the most common that we see in organizations like big organizations, business organizations. Do you remember of us coming across the work that was done in New Zealand?
By Heather Kane, yeah. Some great work in healthcare organizations. There's some, the pioneers. I think the ones that you see now that are doing good work, they're usually the first ones in this space because it's fairly new. Also, some really talking about anti-racism, some of the anti-racism approaches within organizations. A lot of that has been fairly tokenistic diversity training. Sure. We're trying to push way beyond that, obviously. Sure. Any other questions?
I suspect there's lots of questions people just sort of...
1 minute. No, chat to me after. Just a little bit stressful today, but don't let it...
So where's this project going next, Jehonathan?
We're kind of going everywhere. The meta-analysis is the main thing for us. I'm really keen to do these things, like bring it out to researchers first of all. We've been in some conversations with policymakers. I think I mentioned that in the Prezo. So keep these conversations happening and keep making it more and more useful and learning obviously back from the communities also of researchers that we share it with. What are they missing? Is there data that you need to have for your next big survey? Are you thinking to do a survey next? And how could that inform, potential ideas around data management more broadly? So, global directions will be fantastic. I think we need to talk about this a bit more. That's enough.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Thank you.